Bueno, buenas tardes a todas, a todos. Muchas gracias por participar en esta nueva versión del Seminario Internacional de Salud Pública de la Escuela de Salud Pública de la Universidad del Valle. Como bien saben, el objetivo de estos seminarios pues, es tener un espacio de discusión en un idioma internacional, en el caso de hoy en inglés, con uno de los autores de artículos científicos de interés en nuestra área de salud pública y epidemiología. Entonces, hoy nos acompaña la doctora Elizabeth Diemer. Ella es profesora asistente de epidemiología en la Universidad de Pensilvania, Estados Unidos, y profesora adjunta de bioestadística en el Hospital Infantil de Filadelfia, Estados Unidos. Es licenciada en psicología con un máster y doctorado en epidemiología. Su investigación se enfoca en métodos causales para evaluar tratamientos y estrategias de prevención, especialmente en salud psiquiátrica. Y el día de hoy ella nos va a presentar un artículo sobre variables instrumentales que se titula Application of the Instrumental Inequalities to Mendelian Randomization Study with Multiple Purpose Instruments. Y ella nos va a explicar en qué consisten estos instrumentos de variables instrumentales. Entonces, paso a inglés. La idea es que ustedes hagan las preguntas pues al final en inglés y en un último momento pues hacemos algunas preguntas en español que podemos traducir aquí entre todos. Entonces, now we are going to start in English. Thank you very much to Dr. Elizabeth Diemer to be here with us in this academic activity of the Universidad del Valle, Cali, Colombia. You are welcome to come here to visit us in any moment you want. You can start with your oral presentation about your article application of the instrumental inequalities to a Mendelian randomization study with multiple proposal instruments. Thank you very much, Dr. Elizabeth.
All right, I'm just going to share my screen. Sorry, 1 second. Let's see, does that work? Sorry, this is a newer computer, so I have to give a second. All right. All right, so can everyone see my screen? All right, so thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to chat with you all about instrumental variables and my work on the instrumental inequalities. So just to give kind of an outline, which you've already heard about the talk, I'm first going to just give a primer on what instrumental variables are, and then I will discuss falsification of the instrumental variable model using the instrumental inequalities. And then I'll discuss a specific application of the instrumental inequalities to Mendelian randomization studies. So first off, why are we doing this? In public health and in our daily lives, we're often thinking about causal effects. And this applies across questions like whether you should bring a sweater to work in the morning to keep yourself from being cold, to large-scale public health questions like whether drinking alcohol during pregnancy will affect your offspring's future health, or whether fortifying the food supply with folic acid would reduce the incidence of birth defects. Now, unfortunately, we cannot ever estimate individual level causal effects, so I will never truly know whether bringing a sweater will prevent me from being cold. But we can make inferences about causal effects in populations. And in particular, we're often interested in average causal effects. And by that, I mean the mean difference in outcomes had everyone in the population received some treatment A compared to if everyone had received some other treatment A prime. And we often denote this as the expectation of Y superscript A minus Y superscript A prime, where these superscripts indicate counterfactuals, outcomes that would have happened in these theoretical worlds where everyone had been exposed to a particular treatment. And we most often estimate these causal effects using randomized trials. So for this question about alcohol consumption during pregnancy, we could imagine conducting some kind of trial where we took a large sample of pregnant women, assigned half of them to consume some amount of alcohol during their pregnancy, and the rest to abstain. And then by looking at the outcomes in the groups assigned to consume alcohol and to abstain from alcohol, we can evaluate what is the effect of being assigned to consume alcohol versus not. Now, unfortunately, randomized trials are not always feasible, ethical, or timely. In the example of alcohol consumption, we know that alcohol is unsafe for a fetus, so we wouldn't be able to actually conduct a randomized trial that we would know to be harmful. In these kind of situations, we can also estimate causal effects using observational data. The problem with this is that individuals in observational studies are not randomized to treatments. They receive the treatments or exposures that they do for a reason, and these reasons can also affect their likelihood of developing health outcomes. So these are what are known as confounders, common causes of the treatment and outcome. And to the right, you can see a directed acyclic graph that depicts an unmeasured common cause of some treatment A and some outcome Y. Most of the observational designs you might be familiar with rely on an assumption that we have identified, measured, and controlled for all confounders of an exposure or treatment and outcome. So this includes methods like outcome regression, inverse probability of treatment weighting, or the parametric G formula. But we can never truly verify that we've actually identified, measured, and controlled for every possible unmeasured confounder. And in some situations, we actually know that we're missing some of these confounders. So it would be really nice if we had a method that let us estimate causal effects even in the presence of these unmeasured confounders. Instrumental variables are a tool to do just that. These methods allow us to estimate causal effects even when unmeasured confounding is present under a specific set of assumptions. An instrumental variable requires three core conditions. First, it requires a variable known as the instrument that is associated with our treatment, but does not affect the outcome except through that treatment. And it also requires that the instrument and the outcome do not share any common causes. Now, it's important to note that I said that the instrument must be associated with the treatment. In the previous graph I showed, the instrument had a direct effect on the exposure, but that's actually not strictly necessary. It's completely okay to have an instrument that is confounded with the exposure, as long as those confounders do not also affect the outcome. We only care that they're associated, not that that they have a causal relationship. So just to go through some examples that you might have seen or be interested in for instrumental variables, we can first think about the concept of per protocol effects in randomized trials. Earlier, we talked about the effect of randomization to a particular treatment. But in some randomized trials, many, individuals do not adhere to the treatment that they were assigned to. In those cases, we might be interested in estimating the effect of the treatment an individual actually received rather than what they were randomized to. So these are actually a really great application of instrumental variable models, because if we treat randomization arm as our instrument, we know that on average, the third assumption, that the instrument and the outcome share no common causes, is guaranteed to hold on average because of randomization. We also logically can believe that the first instrumental condition will probably hold, since people will probably take the treatment that they are assigned to. So a classic example of this is the Norwegian colorectal cancer prevention trial, or NORCAP, which was a trial of sigmoidoscopy in Norway. And approximately 2/3 of individuals in this trial who were assigned to sigmoidoscopy actually received the treatment. So if we think about the instrumental variable in this case, our instrument is randomization to receive sigmoidoscopy. Our treatment is actually receiving sigmoidoscopy, and our outcome is mortality. So instrumental condition 1 here, randomization is associated with sigmoidoscopy. We can check empirically. Condition 2, randomization does not affect mortality except through sigmoidoscopy. This is probably a reasonable assumption in most cases, but it's not guaranteed to hold by any means. And then the third condition in this case would be that randomization and mortality share no common causes, which again is guaranteed to hold on average across trials, though it may not hold for a particular trial. Another example that we see frequently in literature is Mendelian randomization, which is simply an instrumental variable model that proposes genetic variants as instruments. And typically, in contrast to the randomized trial, Mendelian randomization studies propose many weakly associated genetic variants as instruments. So if we think about an example of maternal vitamin D deficiency, which will come up a lot during pregnancy, and offspring attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, our proposed instruments in this case would be 4 genetic variants that have previously been associated with serum vitamin D sufficiency. Our exposure would be maternal vitamin D sufficiency, and our outcome would be offspring ADHD. Now here, for the instrumental variable conditions to hold, we would have to assume that the genetic variants are associated with vitamin D sufficiency, which we can verify, that the genetic variants do not affect ADHD except through vitamin D sufficiency, which is a more challenging assumption, and third, that the genetic variants do not share any common causes with ADHD. And this may cause a problem if there are population substructures present that affect the distribution of genetic variants and the distribution of ADHD. Some other commonly proposed instruments that people use include distance to care, provider or physician preference, lotteries, and calendar time. So this sounds like a really great deal, but there are a lot of catches. Instrumental variables are not magic. We can see that the third instrumental variable condition is that there are no common causes or confounders of the instrument and outcome. So we can see that this approach just shifts the question of unmeasured confounding from the exposure or treatment to the instrument and outcome. And then second, instrumental conditions 2 and 3 can never be proven true. And you might be thinking, as I did when I first saw these, why couldn't you simply condition on treatment and evaluate whether the relationship between the proposed instrument and the outcome changes? The problem is that even if we had a valid instrumental variable model, if we condition on treatment, we will open up a backdoor path or a selection bias between our proposed instrument and the outcome through the unmeasured confounders. So we would expect that even for a valid instrument, the relationship between the instrument and the outcome would change conditional on the exposure. So we can't use this as a verification technique. Third, the instrumental conditions alone that we've discussed are actually not enough. Using these 3 conditions, we can test whether the treatment has an effect for at least one person in the population, and we can also estimate bounds or upper and lower limits on a causal effect. But we need some additional assumptions for point estimation, which is what we're usually interested in. If we're interested, as we've discussed, in estimating the average causal effect in the whole population, we need to make some form of homogeneity assumption. The strongest version of this is the constant treatment effect, that the effect of the exposure on the outcome is exactly the same for every single person in the population, regardless of what else they have going on in their lives. There are some weaker versions that are a little bit more plausible, which generally sort of rely on an assumption that any unmeasured confounders of the proposed instrument and the exposure are independent of unmeasured confounders of the exposure, treatment, and the outcome. However, it's important to note that homogeneity conditions are often viewed as implausible for many public health questions of interest. As an alternative, if we didn't believe those assumptions were plausible, we could make a weaker assumption to identify a different effect. So we could instead identify what's known as the complier average causal effect, which is the average causal effect of treatment within an unidentified subgroup of individuals in the population. Specifically, these are individuals in a trial setting who would have received treatment if they were assigned to treatment, but would not have received treatment if they were assigned not to receive treatment. This is sometimes also called the local average treatment effect. Now, this does not require homogeneity. It requires a weaker assumption known as monotonicity. In the trial context, this means that we would assume that there's nobody in the population who's a defier, someone who would have received treatment if they were told not to take treatment, but would not have received treatment if they were assigned to take it. So if we look at this little box graph, we can see that we can, in this sort of simple trial setting, divide everyone into 4 different categories. Always takers, who would always take the treatment regardless of what you told them to do. Never takers, who are never going to take the treatment regardless of what you tell them to do. Compliers, who will do what they are assigned to. And defiers, who will do the opposite of what they're assigned to. So we, in order to estimate the complier average causal effect, need to assume that there's no one in the population who's a defier, that everyone is either an always taker, a never taker, or a complier. By doing that, we're then able to estimate the effect within this subgroup of compliers. And we don't really find anything out about the always takers or the never takers. Unfortunately, monotonicity and the complier average causal effect also have drawbacks. The compliers are by definition unidentifiable. I couldn't pick you out of a crowd and say, you're a complier. And the definition of a complier is specific to the study and the instrument. So a person who's a complier in one study will not necessarily be a complier in another. Moreover, the reasoning for studying the compliers can be kind of circular. People will estimate the complier average causal effect because they believe homogeneity doesn't hold, but then they'll generalize the complier average causal effect to the total population, which is then sort of a question of like, why didn't you believe homogeneity held? More problems with them. Instrumental variable methods are not appropriate for studying sustained treatment strategies. There are some extensions recently developed that help with this problem, but you can see here that if you have multiple treatments, the effect of the instrument on the treatment at one time will violate the instrumental conditions for the treatment at the other time. So if you thought you wanted to think about treatment A0, you can see that Z affects A0, but also A1. So you wouldn't be able to determine where the effect that you observed was coming from. Instrumental variable models also require more data than conventional methods. They're less precise. And if your proposed instrument is only weakly associated with your exposure or treatment, you can be vulnerable to some bias, and that same weak association can also amplify other biases in your data. And then instrumental variable models are also vulnerable to forms of selection that don't affect other methods, such as selection on treatment. So in contrast to a more conventional design where you might restrict to individuals who are under one of 2 regimes that you're interested in, you can't do that in an instrumental variable model without introducing bias. So I'm now going to switch to talking about some approaches to falsifying the assumptions we've talked about. I said earlier that instrumental conditions 2 and 3 cannot be verified. We can never prove that these conditions are true in our data set. And investigators typically rely on subject matter knowledge to sort of justify these assumptions for themselves. But it turns out that we can actually sometimes prove that the instrumental conditions are false. And in fact, instrumental variables come with a built-in falsification tool. In the 1990s, Judea Pearl proved that the instrumental variable model implies a specific set of inequalities. If these inequalities, which are called the instrumental inequalities, do not hold within a particular data set, it means that conditions 1 through 3 of the instrumental variable model cannot all be true within that data set. So we can falsify these instrumental variable conditions. Now, importantly, although we spent a while talking about these point identifying conditions, the instrumental inequalities do not require those point identifying assumptions, and they also don't test those point identifying assumptions. So in the all binary setting, what the instrumental inequalities end up looking like is this set of 4, just as a little background. When I first saw these, I did not have any good sense of intuition for them, so I just wanted to give a little bit to you guys. So if we remember back to these principal strata, these 4 types of people, we can remember that the always takers and the never takers will always have a fixed treatment. Always takers are always going to take treatment, regardless of what you tell them to do. Never takers are never going to take treatment, regardless of what you're going to tell them to do. So in those subgroups, we should see no effect of the proposed instrument on the outcome because treatment is constant. So if we saw an effect in these groups, it would indicate that there's some kind of bias happening. Either there's confounding or the instrument has a direct effect on the outcome. Now, unfortunately, we can't, as with the compliers, identify who these people are. But the instrumental inequalities are a way of testing, without identifying these individuals, whether there are any always takers or never takers whose outcomes would diverge under different levels of treatment. And they do this by essentially summing groups of people who should be in the always takers and never takers group. And if there's any overlap, that indicates that something is wrong. So if these falsification approaches are so cool, why does no one use them? Historically, in the all binary setting, the instrumental inequalities were believed to detect only very extreme bias, but they had not previously been applied to settings with multiple proposed instruments. So this Mendelian randomization context, where we might have 4 or even 100 or multiple hundreds of instruments, we'd never applied them in that context. My collaborators and I were interested in understanding how the instrumental inequalities might perform in detecting bias when applied in these Mendelian randomization studies with multiple proposed instruments. So to look at this, we applied the instrumental inequalities to a Mendelian randomization study of the effect of maternal vitamin D sufficiency in pregnancy on offspring ADHD at age 5. So this same example is coming back. To do this, we use data from Generation R, which is a cohort of mother-child pairs in Rotterdam, the Netherlands. These women were recruited during pregnancy, and they and their children were followed up from pregnancy through today. Of the entire sample, there were about 2,000 pairs with complete data on the proposed genetic instruments, treatment, and outcome. Now, it's important to recognize that selecting on complete data in this way could potentially introduce bias, but it's also the way that many Mendelian randomization studies in practice are actually conducted. So for our analysis, we proposed 4 genetic variants that had previously been associated with vitamin D in GWASs as our instruments. And then as a treatment, we evaluated whether individuals' serum vitamin D levels exceeded 75 nanomoles per liter between the 18th and 25th week of gestation. And then to assess offspring ADHD, these children were assessed at age 5, and so individuals were considered positive for ADHD if they screened higher than the 98th percentile on the CBCL attention deficit hyperactivity subscale. Now, when you have multiple instruments, you could apply the instrumental inequalities in many ways. You could apply them to each proposed genetic instrument individually, to any combination of 2, to any combination of 3, or to all 4 jointly. And if you saw violations of the instrumental inequalities for any of those, it would indicate that something is wrong about this graph. At least one of these instruments would be biased. So we applied the instrumental inequalities across all possible combinations of the 4 proposed genetic instruments, and also applied the instrumental inequalities to an unweighted categorical allele score based on these 4 genetic variants. So these are the results in numeric form, but it's a little difficult to read, so I've also prepared a visualization. So in this visualization, horizontal lines represent genetic variants proposed as instruments, and vertical lines represent sets of proposed genetic instruments that are being proposed jointly. The color of the nodes indicates the value of the instrumental inequalities, with white indicating no violation and darker colors indicating increased magnitude of violation. So what you can see here is that the instrumental inequalities were not violated for any of these 4 genetic variants individually or for any combination of 2. But the instrumental inequalities were violated for every combination of 3 genetic variants, for all 4 jointly, and for the allele score. So this tells us, for this particular study, that there is evidence of violations of the instrumental conditions when proposing all 4 genetic variants as instruments. And because we can see that all combinations of 3 violate the instrumental conditions, we know that at least 2 of these genetic variants, so half, must violate the instrumental conditions, because otherwise we would see at least 1 combination of 3 that did not violate the instrumental conditions. On a broader scale, this also tells us that the instrumental inequalities can detect bias in Mendelian randomization studies, and that they may be increasingly sensitive to bias as we propose larger and larger numbers of instruments. So if I was going to conduct a Mendelian randomization study, how would I use the instrumental inequalities? So if violations were detected, as in our study, this would indicate that any analysis requiring that all of our genetic variants are true instruments would produce biased results. To address this, we could either pursue robust instrumental variable methods that allow for a weakening of those instrumental conditions, or we could use subject matter knowledge to try to investigate and determine the source of the bias. If we saw no violations, this tells us nothing. The instrumental conditions may still be biased, and we can indeed see this because we don't see any violation of the instrumental inequalities for each one individually, even though we see a violation for all 4 jointly. So I would recommend that the instrumental inequalities be used in combination with other bias detection approaches and with your own subject matter knowledge. If, based on the results of all of your bias detection approaches, you felt that you still had no evidence of bias, you could cautiously pursue an instrumental variable analysis. But it's important to recognize, too, that the instrumental inequalities cannot identify the source of bias. So when I was first working on this, I was very tempted to think that you could use these graphs to sort of pick out which genetic variant caused the problem. And so if you look at this graph, you can see we have 3 instruments, and whenever Z3 is included in a combination, the instrumental inequalities are biased. But when you only combine Z1 and Z2, we don't see evidence of bias. And this could be very tempting to say, like, oh, clearly Z3 is the problem. Every time Z3 is in this graph, we see a bias. The problem with this is there's actually 2 distinct scenarios that could produce this exact same result. On the left, it could be that what we thought is in fact the case, that Z3 is a strong but invalid instrument that will produce bias, and Z1 and Z2 are weak but valid instruments. But it's equally possible that Z3 is a strong but completely valid instrument, but that Z1 and Z2 are weakly associated with the exposure and directly affect the outcome. So we only see this bias in our studies when they're combined with Z3 because Z3 is stronger. And there's no way to determine which of these 2 actually produce this result. Moreover, besides the question of which one caused the problem, there's a number of different structures that can all create bias in a Mendelian randomization study like this. It's possible that the genetic variants have direct effects. It's possible that there's some shared population structure. It's possible that there's a time-varying exposure. It's also possible that there's some kind of selection process going on, like selection on non-missing data, or selection on the presence of a pregnancy, since we're thinking about the mom's genetic variants, which occur at her own conception. So some limitations to this approach beyond this very specific question of what you can do with them. The instrumental inequalities were developed in conjunction with conventional instrumental variable models. So they're challenging to interpret in the time-varying setting, and violations of the instrumental inequalities may simply result from effects of instruments on exposures over time in a sustained treatment setting. There's some ongoing work happening about extending the inequalities to these sustained treatment strategies. We're also still working on developing the appropriate confidence intervals for these approaches. And then finally, the instrumental inequalities require discrete exposures. They cannot identify bias if your exposure of interest is continuous, but coarsening a continuous instrument into categories can also violate the instrumental conditions. We were interested in seeing how bad that problem is. So we conducted some simulations based on studies of alcohol consumption and cardiovascular disease, where we proposed 4 instruments for a continuous exposure and then varied the effect size and sample size. In each simulation, we then applied 3 different coarsening strategies, dichotomizing at 0, so any drinking versus never drinking, categorizing into 3 categories based on American Heart Association guidelines, and then into deciles. And what we see in these results is that whenever we categorize our exposure into more than 2 categories, we never detect bias using the instrumental inequalities. When we dichotomize at 0, we do sometimes see bias, particularly if the sample size is small, and if we're incorporating a large number of instruments. So this is actually encouraging because it tells us that mostly the instrumental inequalities are not going to detect bias from coarsening, so we can feel relatively comfortable coarsening a continuous exposure in order to apply the instrumental inequalities, even if we plan on using a continuous exposure in our actual instrumental variable analysis. So overall, the things that I hope you take away from this lecture are first, that instrumental variables are not a cure-all. They're a really compelling method that in certain settings can help us answer causal questions that would not be possible to answer with conventional methods. But they replace the assumptions about no unmeasured confounding with other assumptions that are equally strong and not always likely to hold. However, if you are going to apply an instrumental variable model, I would encourage you to consider using the instrumental inequalities, as these are a falsification approach built into the model that do not require additional parametric assumptions or assumptions about the relationship between different instruments. These may be especially useful if you are considering Mendelian randomization studies with multiple proposed instruments. And then I wanted to take a minute to thank my collaborators on this project, including Sonia Swanson, Jeremy Lebrecq, Miguel Hernan, Joy Shi, and Henning Thiemeyer. And then also some special thanks to Noam Finkelstein, Kelly Guo, and Paloma Rojas Sonero. And then I'm open for questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Elizabeth. I have some questions. I can see here because you are working with genetic variants, you have the opportunity to use several instrumental variables, but sometimes instrumental variables has been used in an impact evaluation of public policies. And the idea is that intervention of the policy works as some kind of instrumental variable, but we don't have extra instrumental variables for testing the pair inequalities. What is your suggestions for this situation?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways to think about this. First, so you could still apply the instrumental inequalities in that setting. They're just a little less likely to detect bias if you have bias in your study. You could also consider interacting your sort of policy with other variables that you believe do not modify the relationship between the exposure and the outcome. to generate sort of a set of multiple artificial instruments. And there's some papers on this by Maria Gleemore's group out of UC San Francisco that sort of work in this realm. I would also, in that case, just really advocate for the use of subject matter knowledge and a cautious hand in the interpretation.
Okay, the idea is that the interaction variable is a false interaction variable, but you test against the several levels using that interaction.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow, it's a brilliant approach to test for false interactors, for false effect modificators. Okay, thank you very much. And also you have mentioned that, for example, distance to care is an instrumental variable, but at least here in Latin America, there is a strong relationship between the location of the healthcare centers and also, for example, socioeconomic level of the area. And how can we deal with these associations, at least with the socioeconomic level in the area? Because, for example, here in the city, most of the healthcare centers, hospitals are located on the west side of the city instead of the east side of the city, where the people with the poorer people live. And our distance to the health center really is not really an instrumental variable. How can we deal with that?
Yeah, so that's actually a problem. That's essentially a problem in almost every distance to care example. This also happens in the US because people in rural areas also tend to be poorer. So this is an example where we can really see that we're just shifting our no unmeasured confounding assumption to the instrument. If you have data on the distribution of socioeconomic status by distance to care in your data set, or have data on individuals' socioeconomic status, you can control for instrument outcome confounders in your analysis. And if you and then you're estimating a conditional effect conditional on those different variables. Or you could use something like instrumental, like the inverse probability of treatment weighting or the parametric G formula to get a marginal estimate in that case. But if either you don't have socioeconomic status measured, or if you believe that there's something else going on that's just not measured adequately in your data set, it's not a good instrumental variable.
Okay, thank you very much. Our colleagues, our students, do you have some questions? Also in Spanish, we can translate. Si tienen preguntas en español, podemos traducir. Okay, no more question, and it's some maybe I will do some kind of summary of the in Spanish. I think bueno, I will summarize in Spanish, okay? Bueno, entonces vimos el abordaje de las variables instrumentales con la profesora Elizabeth Diemer. Entonces ella hizo un artículo de simulación pues en el que mostró que ella estaba buscando unas fórmulas que se llaman las desigualdades de Pear, porque ella dice que existe la oportunidad de poner a prueba las condiciones de las variables instrumentales, que ella las presenta 3 condiciones de variable instrumental al inicio de su artículo, y después dice que en el escenario de la genética se pueden poner a prueba esas, con unas fórmulas especiales se puede poner a prueba si las 3 condiciones de una variable instrumental están funcionando. O sea, si aplican para la condición que se está estudiando, generó unas combinaciones entre las variables y pues encontró que algunas de las variantes genéticas no iban a cumplir las condiciones de variables instrumentales según Pear. Lo interesante aquí es ver que ella nos mostró con unos gráficos causales, con unos diagramas causales, nos mostró que la razón de no cumplir con las condiciones de variable instrumental pueden ser varias. Entonces, pues, nos mostraba una variable, una condición genética 3 que aparecía como problemática, pero que podía ser precisamente, había varios escenarios que podía ser un instrumento débil o más bien que las otras dos podían ser un instrumento fuerte y pues esto generó los problemas y que fueron detectados pues por el análisis de ella. Y ella al final pues nos dice que esta metodología que propone nos sirve para encontrar problemas con las variables instrumentales para intentar buscar otros abordajes. Y esa es su propuesta de investigación. No sé si hay alguna pregunta aquí al final sobre esta explicación que acabo de hacer. Yo puedo traducir al inglés para que la doctora Elizabeth conteste. Okay, Elizabeth, we don't have questions in Spanish from the summary, but it was very interesting for us. And now I think that we learned how to, that instrumental variables has been seen as a also something like magic, but as you explained very clearly, also instrumental variables, we have problems with this approach. And now with this method that you present in your article, it's possible to test the conditions of instrumental variables. And it's very interesting to know how, the reasons behind the problem with instrumental variables with several causal diagrams that we have here as an examples. Okay, and I would like to thank you for being here with us, and it was a very interesting talk, and you are welcome to future talks in the future, and also you can recommend another colleague for participating in this space. Okay, thank you very much, and I will say goodbye to everyone also in Spanish. Entonces, muchas gracias a todos por participar en este espacio de la Escuela de Salud Pública de la Universidad del Valle y gracias por su atención y ya podemos parar la grabación.